Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Cricket Daily. It's Monday, the 18th of October. The World Cup has started, so it's cricket festival time. I'm Andrew Menzel, host of the Cricket Unfiltered podcast. I'm joined by Robin Chipperfield, who's been commentating on the WBBL all weekend. I got to hear your dulcet tones. Chippers, how
Oh,
are
lucky
you?
you. Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Lucky you with the old dulcet tones.
Oh, it was excellent. Excellent commentary, of course, especially the
You would
fact
say
that you're
that.
doing it in studio in Sydney, a long way from where the games are being played. That can certainly get you into trouble a few times, but your professionalism shone through, Chippers.
You're too kind,
Felt
Mez.
like you were
You're in a
there.
good mood this morning.
I am. I am. Well, look, lots to talk about in today's show. We've got the
Yeah.
IPL final, the beginning of the T20 World Cup, and then some local cricket action in Australia. And all those people that have applied for the Australian selector position. I'll also give you the person that's been named to join Langer and Bailey at the end of the show. So I think
Can
there's
I
going to be a few
congratulate you on your
disappointed viewers.
appointment?
Yes, you can. Thank you.
It's finally come. Far too late,
Exactly.
but it got there in the end.
That's it. But let's start with the IPL final. Chennai have won their fourth IPL, beating the Kolkata Knight Riders by 27 runs in the final. It was a triumphant night for the veteran MS Dhoni, who just loves winning titles. It was a dominant performance by Chennai, they were sent into bat, and player of the match Faf du Plessis top scored, making 86 off 59. Gaikwad, Upata, and Moeen Ali all made scores of over 30, and Chennai finished with a very impressive 3 for 192. Lockie Ferguson was the most expensive Calcutta bowler, getting pasted, going for 56 in his 4 overs. And then it looked like we were set for a thriller with KKR getting off to a good start after Iyer and Gill put on 91 for the first wicket in 11 overs, but they collapsed from none for 91 to 6 for 120, and then they finished on 9 for 165. Josh Hazlewood took 2 for 28, and Shardul Thakur, who's been recalled into the Indian World Cup squad, took 3 for 38. So a terrific performance by Chennai and Chippers. There was one thing that stood out to me from the game, and that's there was a ball that went up and it hit the spider cam wire and came down. And although the catch was taken off Gill, because the ball hit the wire, it was given not out. And look, I just don't like spider cam, and I think this is an example why.
Yeah, I think what I would say is I think the pictures from Spider Cam in some grounds are amazing. If you kind of see sometimes even outside the ground, you see the surroundings and that sort of thing. I think it looks fantastic. It does give you a better perception. I'm surprised it's not happened before where the ball has hit Spider Cam, whether it be the camera itself or the wires, because it does seem to me that it can be a little bit intrusive and get you a bit too close to the action. Sometimes it feels a bit, as a viewer, it can feel a bit uncomfortable, as though you're intruding on a player's personal space sometimes. As I say, I'm surprised it's not happened before. I mean, the rule is obviously correct, because otherwise, it would cause a great deal of confusion. The moment it hits that, it has to effectively be a dead ball.
Ball.
But yeah, I think in some places it adds a lot, but I'm not sure how many of those places there are. But it does fit as a TV viewer. It brings you closer to the action. I just wish it got out of the way, perhaps a little bit quicker. Sometimes it feels like I get tense when I'm sitting on the sofa watching a game, thinking the camera's a bit too low down here. Can you just back off? And as a viewer, I get a bit tense with that. So sometimes I think it gets a bit close, but probably overall, I think it's been a benefit because it brings you closer to the action. But you obviously don't agree.
No, I don't like it. I think it's like a magic show. And I guess what I really hate about it is when you're at the ground watching a game live, I think it just takes away from the spectacle having this thing running around on wires the whole time. But look, that was just my little rant from the final, because I sort of save up any little bit to pile onto Spider Cam. One day I'm going to get it eradicated from cricket. But a tremendous end to the IPL. MS Dhoni triumphant again in what might be his final IPL, and they got the IPL done. The leading run scorer was Gaikwad with 635 runs. Faf du Plessis was just 2 runs behind on 633. KL Rahul third, 626 runs. And then player of the series was Harshal Patel, and he took 32 wickets at an average of 14.34. And that equals the tournament record for most wickets in an IPL. So I guess, Chippers, the organisers will just be relieved after having to stop it halfway that they could get it done. And we saw, I think, more than ever that money talks and nothing stops for the IPL.
Yeah, and that's understandable, really, given how much money is involved. And it feels like with all sport, really, that, and I think a lot of us thought that this cricket season in the southern hemisphere summer would be different to what we went through last year. And at least at the beginning of it, it's feeling quite similar, with games being moved and grounds being shut and, bio bubbles and all that sort of thing. But, fair play to the IPL for somehow getting through it, and getting all the fixtures done and dusted. And let's just hope that surely next year, things will be back to somewhere near normal. And we'll look back, not with any fondness, but we'll look back at COVID and think, well, they were challenging times, but we managed to get through it. Sport has somehow managed to get through it. And now things are back to where they are, or where they were before.
I think we're going to get a bigger IPL next year with more teams. So a lot to look forward to. But let's stay in the UAE, or near the UAE, because the T20 World Cup has started and it's being played in Oman, this first round. So if you're unaware, that there's a first round with 2 groups of 4, and then the top 2 in each of those groups of 4s go through into the main group. So already we've had the first upset. So Group B of the qualifiers started last night, and there were 2 games. And in the second game, Scotland have beaten Bangladesh by 6 runs. Scotland rallied from 6 for 53 to post 9 for 140. Chris Greaves top scored with 45. He then backed it up with 2 for 19 off 3 overs. He was helped by Brad Wheel with 3 for 24. They restricted Bangladesh to just 7 for 134, winning a famous victory for Scottish cricket in the T20 World Cup. And that's left Group B wide open, Chippers. In the other game, Oman smashed Papua New Guinea by 10 wickets. But Group B now is going to be a tight tussle, you would think.
And what every World Cup needs, whether that's in whatever sport it is, whether it's cricket or football or rugby or whatever it is, it needs an upset. And I think the fact that the Cricket World Cup has had one this early is good, because it will generate a bit more publicity for the tournament and get people involved. And what you don't want is the predictable sides winning all the time. And I appreciate Scotland, Bangladesh, rather than, let's say, Bangladesh, Australia or Bangladesh, India. So it's not involved one of the giants of the game. But to have an upset, I think, this early in the competition is good for the competition. There'll be people in Bangladesh who obviously disagree. But I think that the fact that there is an upset is what every World Cup needs, as I say, from whichever sport it is. It's the upsets generally that you look back on 20 years later and say, do you remember when? So there is that moment already.
Oh, absolutely. And you're right. It's going to generate interest. It'll be shocking for Bangladesh, who came into this with quite a bit of form under the belt, having beaten Australia at home quite convincingly 4-1. They would have felt confident in spinning conditions of the.
Sorry, man. Are you effectively saying there that Scotland would have beaten Australia then? If Bangladesh had beaten Australia and Scotland had beaten Bangladesh, it falls to, it's only logical that Scotland would beat Australia in a World Cup. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think anyone could beat Australia in this World Cup the way we're going. But yeah, look, it'll be a big shock for Bangladesh, because in spinning conditions where this tournament is being played, you would expect them to be more competitive than this. And look, as I said, that group's going to be exciting now, because Oman win their first game. They're at home. They'll fancy their chances against Scotland. And, we could have a really tight Group B. Group A starts tonight, which is probably the stronger of the group on paper, with Ireland playing the Netherlands and Namibia playing Sri Lanka. So another cracking set of games tonight. Namibian coach Pierre de Bruyne believes his team can surprise a few at the T20 World Cup. And this is what stood out to me. A strength of their game is the middle order, which de Bruyne describes as the bomb squad. He's got captain Jared Erasmus, former South African all-rounder David Weiser, and JJ Smith. and they feel 4-6. So Namibia's bomb squad out to do some damage. We might get another upset tonight, Chippers.
Yeah, it's quite a good group, that, isn't it, for Namibia? Because you could make a case for them upsetting all three of those sides, I think, in the competition. Now, they're very unlikely to do that, but that means that upsetting one of them is a distinct possibility. So if you're Ireland, I mean, if you're one of those teams, I mean, Sri Lanka are obviously favourites to win the group, but if you're one of those teams, you think you've got a right chance of making it through, because there's not a huge difference between Ireland, the Netherlands, Namibia, particularly, and then obviously up towards Sri Lanka. But I think if you're one of those other three, you're thinking we've got a right sniff of making it through.
Absolutely. And David Weiser, who's in that middle order for Namibia, he starred in the recent CPL. So who knows what could happen, but look out for the bomb squad. All right, now let's come a bit more local to the WBBL. It's continued over the weekend despite a COVID scare, meaning the games were played behind closed doors rather than with the crowd. But we had wins to the Strikers, the Sixers, the Scorchers, and the Renegades over the weekend. But the highlight was the Sunday afternoon game that finished in a super over, with the Scorchers beating the Heat in a super over after they both tied on scores of 137. So after the weekend's action, then Sydney Sixers are on top with 2 wins from 2 games, and the Strikers and Renegades and the Scorchers have 1 win each. The Hurricanes, none from 2, will be concerning. What was your impression of the WBBL, Chippers, having called most of it over the weekend? I actually think we're seeing a very competitive tournament, and I think the Indians are already adding a lot.
Absolutely, completely agree with that. I think I'm right in saying every game of the 5 we've seen so far went to the final over. That's not to say they were all tense and gripping into the final over. Some of them you felt it was obviously going in one direction going into the final over. That last game yesterday was fantastic between the Scorchers and the Heat, and I think, to my way of looking at it, that elevated the competition, because I thought those 2 teams looked on a different level to any of the other teams we've seen in the competition so far, and that includes the Sydney Sixers, who won both of their games. Pleasingly for the Sixers, they've won both, and there were little stumbles along the way. But I thought the Heat and the Scorchers looked on the evidence purely of that first game, looked on a different level.
What is it that struck you about that? Because I heard you talking about this on commentary, and I mean, I think the Scorchers and the Heat have a little bit more power than some of the other teams. But what else is it to you that you think?
Oh, I thought the fielding was better. I thought the bowling discipline was better generally across the piece. But I think if you looked at the Scorchers with the opening pair of Devine and Mooney, there was some serious power there. For the Heat, again, Grace Harris at the top. There was power that we didn't quite see in other games. And it seemed to me a lot of the time when they needed a boundary on both sides, they would get a boundary, which I think was a good sign that, a lot of the teams had struggled with the pitch because it wasn't coming on necessarily. It was a bit sticky, a bit of a stodgy wicket at Hobart, and that caused problems, I think, for a lot of the teams. I thought the Scorchers and the Heat dealt with it much, much better than anybody else.
Yeah, interesting. I think they will all get better because I think you could just see a little bit of rust in a lot of the players where they've haven't had much competitive cricket in the off season, and there's been restrictions on training for some of the players, and some have done quarantine. So I think we'll actually see the standard get better as the 14 rounds go on. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. But I have to say, before the WBBL and before the summer, Elise Perry was quoted in the paper saying that she thinks there needs to be a critical lens put on women's cricket sometimes for it to be, sort of elevated, because, like men's cricket, you can't just always say everything's good if you want it to be taken seriously. And I was watching the last over of the Scorchers bowling when they would when it ended up being a tie, and Lily Mills was bowling, and she bowled an excellent last over, but she missed 2 clear run-out chances at the bowler's end. And she never looked like actually executing the run-outs. Now, to me, it looked like a nerves thing. and she's seized up in the moment. But what I was surprised about was the TV commentary didn't call out the fielding. I think if it was a men's game and a men's bowler misses two easy run outs at the non-strikers end, you would point it out. I mean, it happens. That's cricket. But I felt that, I think the WBBL needs to take that step. That if something's not good, call it out. Say, look, she needs to work on her fielding at the non-strikers end, because you would expect the Scorchers to have won that game in the last over. And so I'm just curious, from your point of view as someone that commentates on the WBBL, I think you want to be fair, but you also need to call out mistakes when they happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the one out was very similar. I hesitate before bringing this up, but before Nathan Lyon at Headingley, wasn't it? In the Ashes, the Ben Stokes famous Test match at Headingley, where the opportunity to win the game was effectively there, and a comparatively simple return. Lyons might have even been even more simple actually than Lily Mills, but Lyon would have got criticised for that, and did get criticised for that. No player is trying to make that mistake. So as commentators, I think you have to bear that in mind. They are
absolutely.
You have to assume every sportsman and woman is doing their level best. I think if you don't assume they're doing their best, then sport as a whole is in a whole heap of trouble. So you assume they're doing their best, but you have to point out that was a mistake. And I wasn't commentating on that moment. My colleague Andrew Moore was, and I'm sure he did. She's failed to gather the ball she should have done. That kind of line. You don't have to pile in and make it really personal, but I think you have a duty to point out that that a mistake has been made. Now, clearly, commentating on the radio at the time, I wasn't watching the coverage on the television, but I take your point on that.
Yeah, kind of glossed over it. And I just think as Elise Perry says, you've got to call it like you see it. Now, I think there's a sort of, everyone's mindful of promoting the WBBL, but it doesn't really need that anymore. It's already the fourth most successful league in Australia. So what it needs to now do is just stand on its own 2 feet. If someone has a bad performance, you call it out. Lily Mills needs to work on her fielding off her own bowling, because she, could have cost the team the game. That's effectively what happened. But yeah, look, I love the WBBL. It was a great weekend, and can't wait for 2 doubleheaders back-to-back Tuesday, Wednesday. Are you calling them,
Absolutely.
Chippers?
No, I'm not. I'm not this week, so I shall be watching and listening, and keeping an ear out to see who's critical and who's not.
That's it, yeah. It's going to bring this rain of criticism onto the.
As long as we don't have any spider cam, we'll be all right.
Yeah, spider cam and Lily Mills, watch out. All right, and last bit of news: 2 Sheffield Shield matches are underway in Australia. South Australia versus Queensland, WA versus Tasmania. The things to note are some performances for sort of Test contenders. Usman Khawaja has made 174 for Queensland against South Australia. It's his 31st first-class ton and his highest score in Shield cricket since 2014. I would think he would certainly be a strong contender now, Chippers, to open the batting with David Warner. He averages almost 100, and I would think he's the perfect candidate for the Ashes. He's got a lot of experience. He won't be overawed by the situation, and he plays well at home.
Yeah, he definitely plays well at home. I think if the Ashes was in England, it might be a different kettle of fish, but they're not.
Well, there's no one. There's no one that can bat in those conditions.
No, that's true. Well, Smith and Labuschagne seemed to manage it last time, but anyway, Khawaja would be a shout. I was reading over the weekend that Marcus Harris, and I cannot remember for the life of me who was suggesting it, but suggesting that he was the next cab off the rank. Again, he had a difficult spell in the Ashes in England, didn't he? So whether he is, but he's got runs. Khawaja's got a history of scoring runs as well. This is all assuming Pekovsky doesn't make it. And, is Pekovsky the first cab off the rank, assuming he's fit? I guess he is, given the start he made in Test cricket before his injuries.
Yeah, so look out for Usman Khawaja. I wouldn't mind Pekovsky in at number 5 and Khawaja opening, because there's that still.
Well, Travis Head scoring runs, isn't he, at 5? And I tell you what surprised me a bit, and this is a bit different to England, is how somebody scores 100 and the narrative is then they're in contention for the Ashes for that number 5 spot or that number 2 spot. And it seems they don't have to do a lot for the media to pick up on them doing that. Whereas in the county championship, it seems to take a couple of months of good scores for them to suddenly hit the headlines and be a potential England player. I mean, obviously Khawaja, Bukowski, Head, Harris have all got a back history with playing for Australia. Maybe that's the difference.
Yeah, I think probably runs in the Shield are worth a little bit more than in the county championship.
Yep.
A little
Because
bit more,
there are
and
fewer
also,
games.
yeah,
There's
the
fewer
fewer
evidence,
games,
isn't there?
yeah. But you're right. I just think Australia loves playing selector. So as soon as someone scores a couple of hundreds, everyone's debating their spot. Speaking of hundreds, Jimmy Pearson, the Queensland keeper, made 132, his second century in 2 games. And he's sort of seen as not far off Tim Payne's position when he retires. You've kind of got Carey, Inglis, and Pearson all vying for the test keeping duties when Payne finally retires. And Steckity took 7 for 44 for Queensland, his best test figures, and he was selected for Australia on their tour of South Africa that was cancelled. So just look out for Mark Steckity. He might force his way into the Ashes squad, especially if it's a bit bigger than normal. All right, last bit of news. I'll put you out of your misery. I know a lot of you would have applied for the Australian selecting job, including myself. Well, unfortunately, the Daily Telegraph is reporting that 10-test veteran Tony Donamaid has been given the job as new Australian selector. Andrew Mensel's been overlooked.
Cruelly.
So Donamaid's joining Bailey and Langer. He's held a series of administrative roles since retiring, including chief executive of the West Australian and Victorian Cricket Associations. So there you go, Chippers. I'm not a selector, unfortunately.
A name from my youth growing up, watching video cassettes, I think, of England tours down under with Tony Donamaid playing for Australia. Would have been in that, late 80s, I would think, off the top of my head,
yep.
Late 80s, early 90s.
That's it.
Yeah, and one of those names with Tim Zura and people like that you don't hear much about these days.
Yeah, I hope he does a good job, but I'm a bit surprised they haven't really been imaginative with this at all. Who was the selector England brought in 3 years ago?
Ed Smith.
Ed Smith. Now, he came at things from a different angle. I just wonder if there was room in Australian cricket for someone who thinks a bit differently.
He didn't last long, Ed Smith, did he? That's the only thing I'd say to that.
He made some big changes.
He did, and to be fair, a lot of them have been reversed since. So I'm not convinced that was an unmitigated success. Let's put it like that.
Well, let's hope Donamaid does better. Chippers, thanks for joining me on Cricket Daily. We'll catch up soon.
Thanks, mate.